class, as part of our unit on literature and gender, we've been reading and discussing Much Ado About Nothing, right? Right. So I know we've read and discussed the play a bit in class already, but I really want to take some extra time to show you the importance of looking at a play through a different lens. Now, you might say, what is a lens? Well, when we study literature, we can put on different lenses, just like glasses, to help us view and analyze literature better from a specific point of view. There are many different lenses we can apply when we analyze literature, but today we're going to view Shakespeare's play through a historical lens, looking at the period and exploring the relationship between literature and history. We can research secondary sources and use them to aid our understanding of history and culture when we read and interpret texts historically, which can help us better understand and interpret the literature we read. Okay, so now you might be like, why is it so important to look at text through this historical lens? Well, when we read Shakespeare or watch his plays today, it can be easy to forget they were once brand new. Okay, so now you might be like, why is it so important to look at text through this historical lens? Well, when we read Shakespeare or watch his plays today, it can be easy to forget they were once brand new. You might say that Shakespeare's Hamlet and Othello were once the Hamiltons and Dear Evan Hansons of their day. And just like the plays and musicals we have today, many of Shakespeare's plays were affected by the current events, values, and politics of the day. Sometimes these plays aligned with and upheld the values of the day, and other times they opposed them. When we look at the historical context of the play, we can understand the culture that was influencing and impacted the author, and in turn, this can help us to better understand the events and characters in the literature that we read. But enough about those lenses. Let's apply this lens to what we're reading already. Today, I want us to look at one of the hot topics during Shakespeare's time, gender roles. Specifically, I want us to look at the role of women in the 16th century and see how Shakespeare's portrayal of women was complicated, how he often created characters who both aligned with and contradicted 16th century society's expectations of the day. To do this, we will use secondary sources to travel back to the Elizabethan era and see exactly what the expectations for women were in society during the 16th century. Then we're going to take a look at Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing and compare and contrast how the two main women in the play, Hero and Beatrice, align with and contradict these expectations for women during Shakespeare's time. So let's get down to it. Let's go back to the 16th century England and see how the people of the day expected the women to act. The Elizabethan era, according to Michael Best's research, was one which focused heavily on the expectations and perceptions of women. It was a conservative society and one where religion and tradition both emphasized men over women. Although the culture did emphasize men over women, this was a confusing time because England looked up to Queen Elizabeth, a woman, as the governing authority. Elizabeth probably wasn't the first choice for the ruler of England, as kings usually did everything they could to provide a male heir for the English throne. For instance, the Philadelphia Shakespeare Theater's informative webpage, Shakespearean Women, references the extreme measures King Henry VII took to obtain a male heir, and thus shows us how kings expected queens to provide them an heir and to submit to the will of their authority. It is also important to realize the culture of acting during the Elizabethan period and how it contributed to the portrayals and expectations of women during the time. In her journal article about cross-dressing in Shakespeare's time, Jean Howard gives us some critical insight to the culture of cross-dressing in the theater and the impact it had on gender roles in the theater and within the Elizabethan era itself. Howard notes that men playing women's roles, although physically different, portrayed the female as was expected of her during the time, acting softer, weaker, less hot. She even quotes another Shakespearean scholar who emphasized that during the Renaissance, there often appeared to be only one sex, women being but imperfectly formed or incomplete men. Again, we can see that because men portray women in the plays, then the dominant gender at the time, men, also had the power to control the cultural expectations of women. Phyllis Racken confirms this in her book, Shakespeare and Women, too. Here she emphasizes that even though the roles of women were designed to be played by boys in the theater, they still had a huge impact on the cultural role of a woman and what it meant to act like a woman. She says that since the male author and male players depicted these women, it was often their depictions that were ascribed to women, and these often included proverbial warnings for how women weren't to act. When the women characters within plays portrayed females who were not acting like the typical women of the day, they produced anxieties about women being in power in the male audience. It was usually assumed that these characters weren't in their expected places and probably engaging in extramarital sex. This is especially interesting when we put into context that the Queen said multiple times that she had the body of a woman, but the heart and stomach of a man. In a sense, the Queen herself was cross-dressing, taking upon herself the characteristics of a man to be taken more seriously by her subjects. Although you can have a woman acting like a man on the throne and men acting like women in the theater, Racken argues that the Elizabethan audience, both men and women, would both have acknowledged the sex of the body beneath the gendered clothes. And Racken argues that oftentimes these costumes in the theater only emphasized the true sex of the body beneath them. So, even though the audience knew the actors were playing women, they were always aware of who was really playing the characters, who had the authority to say what a woman should or shouldn't do. Although there were many expectations for women during the day, I want to focus on 4 which have the most impact in Much Ado About Nothing: marriage, intelligence, speech, and chastity. The Philadelphia Theater's webpage, Elizabethan Women, mentions that a strict religious preference for Christianity at the time contributed to laws which formed around ensuring women were dutiful wives and mothers. This emphasizes the expectation for women to marry and to remain faithful to their families. Women were also expected to be less intelligent than men were. Many women in Shakespeare's time were educated. Their education just looked different from the men's. The Philadelphia Shakespeare Company emphasizes that some girls were allowed to enter grammar school as early as the mid-1500s, but they weren't allowed to proceed to a university or work in professional fields. A woman's proper education consisted in learning to sew, paint, dance, and play musical instruments, and her primary occupation was keeping her house and looking and sounding pleasant. But even the women who did get more of a male education, like Queen Elizabeth, were expected to be inferior intellectually to men. Michael Best notes that contemporaries of Shakespeare emphasized the common notion that women were inferior to men. For example, the Queen's tutor, Ascham, compared her intelligence to that of a man's, stating that she almost thought as a man did, which seems to indicate that he felt men were superior to women in intelligence. Howard also mentions in her study that women who talked too much, who were scolds, were put up on a cucking stool and dunked in water to stop the uncontrolled mouth. And this emphasizes the importance society placed on women's speech. It was to be more guarded and reserved. So we can see how marriage, inferior intelligence, and reserved speech were all expected of women during the Elizabethan era. Although marriage, intelligence, and speech were important, the most important expectation of women in the 16th century was to remain virtuous. Married women were to stay faithful to their husbands, and single women were to remain virgins until they married. In fact, this was the governing ideal of women during the 16th century, and much of the value of women was fixed to their chastity. Stephanie Chamberlain actually explores the importance of women's sexual integrity in her journal. In her research, she focuses on Much Ado About Nothing and emphasizes Claudio's reference to Hero as a rotten orange, stating that men saw women as marketplace commodities, just like fruit. Both are prized when they're in good condition, however, both lose value quickly if they aren't in pristine condition. So, a woman's reputation was based on her chastity, but scholars also note that this reputation was interconnected with her family. Chamberlain notes that if a woman was found to be unchaste, she wouldn't just ruin her reputation, she would ruin her family's reputation too. She quotes Juan Luis Vives' Instruction of a Christian Woman, which was written in the 1500s near the time of Shakespeare, and says, "You will not easily find an evil woman unless she be one who is ignorant of, or at any rate gives no thought to, the importance of the virtue of chastity. She is unaware of the evil she commits if she loses it, not considering the blessing she exchanges for a base, empty, and momentary illusion of pleasure, and what a train of evil she ushers in with the loss of chastity. She does not consider how empty and senseless a thing physical pleasure is, and that one should not even lift a finger for its sake, let alone cast away woman's most beautiful and priceless possession. Therefore, we can see that society expected single women to remain honorable through abstinence. This importance of honor through the morality of women was really important to men in this patriarchal society. So it became expected and important to women as well. Mohammed Jaja notes in his study that most men didn't have trust or faith in women. He emphasizes that most women didn't have an identity or status without a husband, though, so women were encouraged to ignore and accept this and to still strive for marriage. Some people, like the queen, could get away with not marrying, as her status and position allowed her the resources to provide for herself and retain an identity despite remaining single. The queen did, however, adhere to her gender's expectation to remain chaste. This doesn't mean that she didn't manipulate these expectations for her own political gain, though. Because virginity was so valued and expected of women in the Elizabethan culture, Queen Elizabeth not only remained single, but also remained, at least in society's eye, chaste, which gave her more respect and therefore power as a ruling woman. Michael Best notes this in the Internet Shakespeare edition. He states that by remaining a virgin, the queen almost raised her status to that of the Virgin Mary, the ultimate ideal woman during the Elizabethan era. Cohen also mentions in his journal that there was a cultural fear of men being dominated by women, and that when women had sex outside of marriage, which was called cuckoldry during Shakespeare's time, it was the equivalent of women taking some power from men. It's important to remember that the Elizabethan era was a patriarchal culture, one where men were valued over women, and in such an environment, cuckoldry was, as Cohen states, a big threat. He mentioned that it could affect a man's social status and even his masculinity. Having an unfaithful woman was the equivalent of being weak, of being a woman herself. When we realize the expectation for women to be chaste and for men to fear cuckoldry and expect purity, marriage, inferior intelligence, and reserved speech in women during the 16th century, we can begin to see how these expectations also dictated many events and characters in Shakespeare's plays. In Much Ado About Nothing, we have two main female characters, Beatrice and Hero. Now let's look and see how society impacted them. First, let's take a look at Hero. Although Hero is a main character, she doesn't have as many lines as Beatrice does, and therefore we have a little bit less to work with. But we can still see how Shakespeare has created a complex character, one who conforms to and contradicts expectations for women during this time. Carol Cook shows us how Hero's characteristics help to label her as an ideal woman during the time. She is meek, self-effacing, vulnerable, obedient, seen and not heard, and she is a face without a voice. This is significant when we remember that society at this time expected women to be reserved in speech and weaker than the male sex. Hero also conforms to the typical woman's weak response after she is accused of sexual impurity. She faints, and she loses both her and her father's integrity and worth through this false accusation. Even once everything is resolved and Hero is found to indeed be pure and virtuous, she welcomes a marriage to Claudio, even after all he has done to shame her. Ultimately, she obeys what her father tells her to do and seems to value marriage and her morality just as was expected of women at that time. However, Hero also gives us a tiny taste of opposition to the expectations of the Elizabethan era when she answers Don Pedro at the dance, stating that he can only be in her presence when she decides to let him be there. Look at Act 2, lines 73 through 80, and note her response when Don Pedro asks to be in her company. Don Pedro says, "With me in your company?" And Hero says, "I may say so when I please." Towards the end of the play, we also see Hero stick up for herself. She pretends to be another woman to win Claudio's heart once again, and speaks up for herself after she reveals her true identity. Look at Act 5, Scene 4, lines 63 through 65. Here, Hero stands up and defends her virginity, saying, "Nothing certainer. One hero died defiled, but I do live, and surely as I live, I am a maid." In the end, though, Hero still marries Claudio and seems to value and adhere to the expectations for chastity and marriage, thus creating a very complex character. Now, let's take a look at Beatrice. At first, we see how Beatrice defies gender expectations of the day. The woman, as Cohen says in his study, was a figure in whom female agency and masculinity are associated. Why? Well, Cohen reminds us that when Leonardo conveys his desire for Beatrice to marry one day, she replies, "Not till God make men of some other metal than earth. Would it not grieve a woman to be overmastered with a piece of valiant dust?" She also suggests that she is the wearer and giver of horns. She is the one who remains masculine and the one who grants masculinity to a future spouse. Thus, Beatrice refuses to marry, defiantly going against the expectations for women to marry during that time. We can also see how Beatrice defies expectations to remain reserved in speech and to be intellectually inferior to men when we look at her speech, too. Leonardo warns Beatrice that her curtness will keep her single, but she doesn't seem to care. The fact that Beatrice matches Benedict's wit throughout the entirety of the play alone is contradicting to the expectations of women to be intellectually inferior to men. She not only stays with Benedict, but she sometimes one-ups him with her witty comments. Her mocking proclamation on love and marriage to Benedict really puts down the expectation for women to marry and find protection and security in doing so. In the text, she states, "Wooing, wedding, and repenting is as a Scotch jig, a measure, a syncopace. The first suit is hot and hasty like a Scotch jig, and full as fantastical. The wedding, mannerly, modest, is as a measure, full of state and anxiety. And then comes repentance, and with his bad legs fails into the syncopace faster and faster, till he sink into his grave." Carol Cook also shows us how Beatrice puts down the expectation for women to obey and listen to their fathers. She tells Hero, "Yes, faith, it is my cousin's duty to make courtesy and say, 'Father, as it please you.' But for all that, cousin, let him be a handsome fellow. Or make another courtesy and say, 'Father, as it please me.'" Thus, we see how Beatrice is labeled as an abnormal female during the Elizabethan era. However, we also see the typical weaknesses and inferiority expected of women in Beatrice. After all of her defiance of gender expectations, Beatrice's "Oh, that I were a man" speech, rather than proposing an alternative to masculine values, as Cook notes Beatrice probably should do. She regrets for their decline, and she slides back into her gender's expected reaction to such a tragedy. One that echoes Hero's own decision to silently die a woman. In the speech, Beatrice asks Benedict to fight Claudio because she cannot do it herself. She can wish that she were a man, but she also thinks her only response in the end is to reciprocate the expected helplessness of a woman like Hero did and die as a powerless woman. Here she says, "Princes and counties, surely a princely testimony, a goodly count, Count Comfort, a sweet gallant, surely. Oh, that I were a man for his sake, or that I had any friend would be a man for my sake. But manhood is melted into curtsies, valor into compliment, and men are only turned into tongue, and trim ones, too. He is now as valiant as Hercules, that only tells a lie and answers it. I cannot be a man with wishing, therefore I will die a woman with grieving." Just as Hero ends up succumbing to the expectations of her gender, we see that in the end, Beatrice too married Benedict, and even after all of her opposition to marriage in the beginning of the play, she still marries him. Now that we've looked at what the expectations for women were during Shakespeare's time and how Hero and Beatrice both conformed to and contradicted these expectations, we can better understand why these characters acted and were treated the way that they were. Before class tomorrow, I'd like for you to think about these parting questions. Can you think of any other instances where Shakespeare paints women in light of or against the expectations of the day? What were the results for these women? And how do you think society expects women to act now? And what contributes to this? Can you think of any authors who paint women who follow or contradict these expectations? Thanks, class. I hope you enjoyed this, and I can't wait to discuss it more in class tomorrow. Bye!